This is Thrive Perspectives, an ever-growing discussion about the issues and ideas that shape our lives, with your guide, Dr. Matthew Jacoby.
Morning, Matt. Good morning, Connell. Back in the studio, Thrive Perspectives, Christian Worldview. Connell,
Sure
thanks for the coffee, although it was a long wait this morning.
It was. I don't know what was going on there. Coffee machine was broken down or something, but 25 minutes to get a coffee.
I think we've been going long enough now. We should actually have our own barista and coffee machine in the studio. What do you think, Matt?
Sounds good.
Yeah, you'd be there, wouldn't you? You'd be here early every time.
Right. Yeah,
we wouldn't have to ring you up and remind you.
Right.
You'd be here for his coffee.
Yeah.
Well, morning listeners, great to have you back with us. We're going to continue our conversation on Thrive Perspectives around Christian worldview. And last week we had a really challenging but interesting conversation as we visited the sort of thoughts and philosophy of collective responsibility, community responsibility or collective responsibility for the brokenness of humankind, really, and the fact that it's very easy for us perhaps sometimes to separate ourselves out and look at others and judge their behaviour in the present and in the past, when in fact we all have the propensity and the nature in us, unfortunately, as broken people, to be as bad as each other. And we did look at particularly the history of our nation. We looked at some of the atrocities that happened at the beginning of our history as a nation. But again, that was just an example. These things have happened all around the world, and it's not just about that stuff. It's about our everyday life as well. It's about how we look at other people, how we judge other people, and how we need to be reminded constantly that we all have the propensity to behave poorly and to not treat each other as we should.
That's right. Yeah, the key point really here is an attitudinal one. There is something that bothers me in the way often that these issues are spoken about, and in particular the attitude that I think we can easily take. And I've discovered this in myself. And so this conversation's coming from an element of self-discovery and an effort to move towards what I believe is a Christian attitude, Christian approach to Christ-minded approach, let's put it that way, to things like this. And, there are lots of different issues, and we talked about the Indigenous issues. I talked about, even issues in my own family line with my, German background. And, today I think we'll move away from specific issues and talk about this. And generally, perhaps, we can use examples. But the illustration that I used, and this is probably a good place to start, is that I feel that in our society, we tend to envisage ourselves as like an audience in a stadium. Events of the world, past and present, are being played out on the field, and of course it is a little bit like that, because we watch these things on our TV screens and we watch the documentaries and we see all the terrible things that people have done down through history. And one of the problems is that we can envisage ourselves as like the people in the grandstands, and on the field are good guys and bad guys, and we boo the bad guys and we cheer the good guys. And if we boo the bad guys and cheer the good guys, then we think, well, we're the good guys, right? Because being a good guy means that you boo the bad guys and cheer. Boo the bad guys and cheer the good guys. Got to get that the right way around. And I feel that particularly in our culture, that it's a little bit like that. Everyone has strong opinions about, what's happened in the past, and boo, that's those terrible people, but they're horrible, and so there are the perpetrators of evil, and then there are victims, and that's no doubt the case. There are totally. The great evils have been done, and people have suffered terribly from great evils. That is the story of human history. So we don't want to diminish that in any way whatsoever. Yeah. The problem with that picture is that the way that we set ourselves off from that situation, that we're somehow separate to that. I think that is the attitudinal issue that we want to deal with, because that's not really constructive, and it's certainly not consistent with a Christian worldview. Because in a Christian worldview, we all share in this common human condition. this, what I described as a kind of God complex. You know, to some extent, we have this compulsion within us to, you know, independence and autonomy. And even as Christians, we still, you know, we have by the power of the Holy Spirit, you know, we have power over that, but it's still within us, you know, so that we still need to put to death the sinful nature, and we need to live by the Spirit.
And a superiority complex.
Yeah,
as
and
well.
that,
you know,
and
that
that's,
goes with that.
that's
God
right.
complex,
And
yeah.
so that expresses itself in a superiority complex because, you know, part of that is that we have this propensity to want to build our own identity, and we do that in comparison to others. And so that's where you get your superiority complex.
Yeah.
And this is, you know, this is so much the story of human history, is one group against another, and it's the fragmentation of humanity happened because of the broken relationship with God. And so there's something has been imbued into human nature that sets us against one another.
It's not even just history though, Matt. Like it's the culture of today. I mean, you look at it, everybody seems to be dividing up between the good guys and the bad guys.
Yeah.
If you look, pick every group in society, whether you're talking about Indigenous or you're talking about sexual orientations, or you're talking about males versus females, or you're talking about the boomers versus the millennials, you know, and it just goes on.
Or the left and the right of politics.
Right. Yeah. And everybody wants to sort of divide themselves into what we see ourselves as this is the side of the good guys, and over here's the side of the bad guys. And it's like we're trying to identify. Everybody wants to identify with one of those.
That's right.
We always think our side's the good guy and the other side's the bad guy.
So although sometimes we might say we're the bad guys and they're the good guys. That happens as well. But, I mean, the problem is with the whole picture is what we're saying here.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to imagine. I think most people generally want to be on the side of the good guys, but it also does apply equally to those. I mean, why would you identify with the side of the bad guys? But I think some people do reach a point in life where they see themselves as a bad guy and beyond hope.
I think maybe you're referring to historically we can look back and go, well, we were probably the bad guys.
Yeah.
You know, looking at your context in terms of the Second World War and German or
so you can be self-loathing, or condemning your living with that condemnation.
Yeah, I heard someone say recently, a social commentator, describe our society as a society of self-loathing.
Yeah,
and I think that's problematic too. Yeah. You know, because we talked a little bit about that recognition that we all share in this common human nature, but self-loathing isn't the answer to that either.
No. Yeah.
You know, so even identifying with the bad guys, and you know, there can be a wrong approach to that even as well.
Yeah. Well, there's a problem there with even the word, because we use the word identify. I mean, we hear that all the time anyway. You know, culture anyway. But you know, everyone identifies with something, and so I think when you end up doing is when you identify yourself with certain issues and certain causes and certain sides of the argument, it actually becomes your identity. So being right and defending the rightness of your position becomes almost an attack on your identity, irrespective of what side of the fence you're on. I'm not talking about identity. Necessarily identity politics, but I'm talking about we want to create our identity on being part of the good guys. And in doing so, we're actually kind of inoculating ourselves against
of the bad
guys being one of the bad guys.
And sometimes if we are on the side of the bad guys, and this is, I guess, my experience from my German background, there's a tendency in my generation, and I know this, I felt this a little bit in sort of discussions with other people with the similar background, is that there is this tendency to say, yes, we're the bad guys, but in an unhealthy way, in a sense, condemns what was done, but condemns that former generation. You know, it's like we so in a sense we make ourselves that we make atonement in a sense by
agreeing
sort of condemning,
agreeing
that they were bad. Oh yes, we've done. And so even if there's a sense of identification with, you know, with this group of people, there can still inside that be this almost this attempt at atonement by sort of cutting off that former generation. And again, there's a problem with that because the assumption is that, well, if I lived back then with the same cultural conditioning, the same upbringing, the same, everything, then, well, I would never have, joined Hitler's army in the 1930s, and I would never have grabbed hold of the promise of getting land in occupied territories and all of the incentives that my own own forebears were offered and took, and so my attitude could be, they're terrible, and sort of almost take on that self-loathing attitude, but that easily can become a deflective thing because you just end up condemning your own forebears.
It's the same thing, really, as trying to identify with the good guy. You can be one of the bad guys, but if you identify,
I make atonement by self-loathing in a sense.
Make yourself one of the good guys again, in a way that you can means that you can point the finger back at those that you would consider to be the bad guys. And that's really the position that it takes you into, is that you end up pointing the finger at people, is looking to figure out who to blame or who we're not like, or, we put that distance between us. Yeah. Whatever we're doing, it always ends up in the pointing of the finger and the judgment back of condemnation back on other people that we aren't like.
That's right.
So we're really building a narrative around our lives and putting ourselves where we want to put ourselves into the story where it's most convenient and comfortable for us.
Yeah, that's right. And neither are we saying, if we identify a certain group of people as good guys, by cancelling out the distinction between good guys and bad guys, we're not saying that any group of people warranted what they got. It's not justifying anything because terrible things have been done throughout human history. And so the playing field thing is an unfortunate way of thinking. And I'm just using that metaphor because I think it does tend to describe, I've been in stadiums with two teams and people barracking for their team. But what we're wanting to say here, and we want to move towards, well, what is the right attitude towards this? That's where we're moving here.
Can I just one more thing that I think is worth saying, and just reflecting back on what you said before, Connell, about we tend to position ourselves with a side and we're not going to be moved from that side, whatever it is, whether it's politics or whether it's a particular aspect of the good guys, bad guys thing. I think the other thing we tend to do is we tend to align ourselves with whoever we think, particularly if it's people-oriented, identity-oriented, a person or people or a political party or a footy team or whatever it might be. And then regardless of what we do, we justify it as good because that's our team. And rather than being able to separate out behaviours and go, actually, that's not a good behaviour. And instead of writing the whole person off because of that, the same thing happens in reverse, if you know what I'm saying. So I think sometimes, particularly these days, this whole identity thing you were talking about before, we identify ourselves with a particular group or a particular person or whatever it might be. And then we kind of overlook the things that we start to make things that we probably know deep down that's not such a great thing. We make it okay because otherwise we're not barracking for the good guy. And so it all comes down to we can suddenly justify a whole lot of things. I mean, probably, again, not to point the finger at you, but thinking about Hitler and where he started and it was just there was such a lot of good things he did early on in terms of rebuilding Germany and stuff. And it became really easy to overlook little things because, he was still the good guy, for the German nation.
Yeah. And even looking back, it was interesting. I listened to a documentary, audio documentary on the Second World War that looked specifically at the bombing raids on the Allied side and talked about how, this kind of firebombing cities and
Dresden and places
like that. Yeah, that's right. And how it actually didn't really make much difference. I mean, the consensus amongst the historians is that, maybe it shifted morale a little bit but it didn't make that much difference. But the destruction and the death, like the general destruction and death that was wreaked upon these people was just unthinkable. And you can also think about the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the nuclear bomb. Now, we tend to look back and think, well, that was warranted because
it ended the war. It ended the war.
Because it ended the war. But it doesn't take away from the fact that this was actually a terrible, terrible thing. And lots of people suffered from this. And so, that's where we tend to justify the behavior of who we see as the good guys.
Correct. Yeah.
Because they're the good guys. And that's problematic as well. So I think it's more constructive to look at the human predicament as this cycle of dysfunctionality, essentially. I mean, that's to even put it lightly. We are all actually involved in this at some level. And so there are not good guys and bad guys, but we all share this human nature with this God complex superiority thing, that you're building identity, comparing ourselves to one another, wanting more recognition than you. And I think to some extent we all share in that, and I think it's important that we don't, because we might say that there are some people that, perhaps don't do that and that seem perhaps to be the humble but let's not confuse humility with injured pride or a broken down pride, because yes, some people are more successful. Some people become more powerful and some become powerless. And the Bible recognizes that. So the biblical worldview recognizes and it holds the powerful more accountable. So that's important in those situations. There's no doubt about that. Yeah. However, that doesn't take away from the fact that the powerful and the powerless still share in this common human predicament and this corrupted human nature. And even amongst the powerless, they can even in their relationships to one another or even their attitudes towards the powerful can also go wrong. That can also go wrong as well.
Yeah. And that's a tendency we have in society where we actually view people who are powerless and people who are genuine victims. We do the right thing in terms of getting around the victims in society that have experienced real pain and suffering at the hands of people who have done real wrong that they need to be held absolutely accountable for. But even there, if we look at and talk about that group of people, that they also are collectively responsible, not for what happened to them, be clear about that, but sharing collective responsibility because we're all part of humanity. And that's a place that is really, really difficult for us to go to because we want to get around those who have been hurt, as we should. But the way that we think about it, it becomes an unhealthy conversation to say, to sort of start pigeonholing people and say they're in that group, they're the good guys and these are the bad guys. It always takes us back into that kind of framework.
Victim perpetrator type
and the biblical worldview is difficult to wrap your head around because it actually says we are all, even those who have been hurt, the most in society, are still collectively responsible for humanity, the bad and the evil. The actual root of the problem is inside us as humanity.
That's right. And that doesn't take away from the evil that was done to them.
No.
But it does still put us all in this same pool that's constantly problematic. We're all part of this. Perhaps a biblical example would help at this point.
Yeah, great.
One of the themes that runs through the teaching of Jesus and of course the background to the ministry of Jesus was the Roman occupation and the tendency of the Jewish people to cast the Romans as the evil people and we're the good people. And this is something that Jesus addressed again and again because the attitude was we need to kick these terrible, evil Romans, these unclean, the unclean Romans. We need to kick them out of the land, and we can have our pristine kingdom. A lot of the teaching within the Sermon on the Mount is designed actually to address the attitude behind that. Okay, so he's calling for in the Beatitudes, blessed are the poor in spirit and those blessed are those who mourn and blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, and in other words, the idea there is that the blessed is the person that recognizes their own brokenness in a sense. Then it's turn the other cheek. And if someone, if your enemy asks you to go a mile, go 2 miles. And if he wants to take your cloak, give him your tunic also. And so it's this non-retaliation thing. But
Matthew 20, chapter 5.
Yeah, that's in Matthew chapter 5. And then, Matthew chapter 6, and then chapter 6 is really about prayer and seeking the kingdom of God. And then you go into chapter 7, then you've got the teaching about judgment, right? Do not judge. And that's still, there's a context for this. This isn't a contextless bit of teaching. And the context was their propensity, of course, to want to separate between the clean and the unclean. Like, we're God's people. We are the righteous and the Romans and the people that work for the Romans, they're the evil guys. So, for example, the tax collectors are a famous biblical example. They're the evil people. They're evil, particularly evil because they're meant to be on our side, but they're serving the bad sides. It's the good guys and the bad guys. And this is where, and can I say too, there were real evils being done. Romans were heavy-handed. They were heavy-handed. They invented what is probably the cruelest form of torture and execution, which is crucifixion. They invented that, right? They were cruel occupiers, and they taxed the people. And if, they put down, whenever there were uprisings, that thousands and thousands of people were killed, crucified. Lots of evils were being done. That's why in the first part, in chapter 5, why Jesus is saying, if your enemy strikes you on the cheek, turn the other cheek also. Like, don't retaliate. Now, they would have been thinking, what? But Jesus, you haven't, look at what we're suffering here. Like, we are suffering under this very powerful, we are the powerless, under this powerful empire that are doing these terrible things to us. Every day people are walking past crosses with people who are trying to rebel against these evil people. They were the ones that were often crucified, right? So this is where he comes in with his teaching. If you judge another person, it's like you're trying to remove the speck from someone's eye, the bit of sawdust from someone's eye, when you've got a plank in your own eye. And the importance of that is the relationship between the speck of dust, the sawdust, and the plank, right? The speck of sawdust comes from the plank. That's where, so there's a relationship between those two. So we all have the plank. The plank is that, you could say perhaps, and you don't want to stretch that metaphor too far, but I think it's safe to say that he's saying, in a sense, we've all got the plank, and the speck of dust kind of comes off the plank, right?
It's also a lot smaller than the plank. Yeah, this too is what I read into it as well. The log or the plank, and the speck is tiny compared to the size of the plank that's in your eye. Yeah. I mean, Jesus didn't need to he was making a point with that, because he could have just said, look, just don't judge people. But he actually gave the context for that in identifying the log and taking the plank and the speck. He's really saying there, it's hard to judge other people, because as much as you're judging them for the speck, you have the log in your eye. He's clearly saying there that
the speck comes from the log, and you have the log.
That's and you're in no position actually to set yourself apart from the person. That totally lines up with collective responsibility, because that puts the framework in terms of how do we judge. I don't think we're not meant to judge, or at least discern and hold people to account for wrongdoing.
In that sense,
In that sense. But it is an attitudinal thing, as you say. I guess if we're going to hold people to account, we do it with an attitude of knowing that we're not necessarily different.
That's right. So let's just drill into what you just said then, because I think it's important to recognize also what Jesus isn't saying by that.
Yep.
Now, okay, just to clarify, what he is saying is that we all share the big issue, right? Is the plank or the log is this fundamental sinfulness of human nature, right? We all carry that to some extent, and that is the cause of the evils in the world. Now, it manifests in different ways in different situations, and that's the kind of specks off the log, but the log, the root cause sits in human nature. And so that's where what he's saying is that we can't set ourselves off from those whom whose behavior we might object to doesn't take away from the fact that their behavior is objectionable. So yes, it is indeed evil. It's not diminishing the fact that people do evil things. The problem is when we set ourselves off from that as though we don't share in the fundamental problem. Right now, it might manifest differently. The problem or the sort of the fruit that comes from that root problem might be different for us than it is for them. But, we can't set ourselves off from. So that's what he is saying. What he's not saying is that we can't therefore hold each other accountable or that we can't seek some redress for evil or, and he's certainly not saying that there can't be civil judgment, civil judges because, the law of Moses,
put that in place,
that there would be just judgment, that there would be justice in the land. And so it's, and even today, we have situations. I mean, we have courts and we have justice systems, and that's good. Like there should be. And we don't want, we want in a sense people to, in some sense, get their just desserts. But even that is problematic in the sense that no one ultimately gets what's coming to them for the real core sort of issue.
Well, they will at the end of time.
Yeah, that's right. There remains a great day of judgment in the future, and that's when final justice is done. So in any case, final justice is never really ever realized in this life. However, Jesus isn't saying that there can't be sort of civil justice in that sense. He's not even saying that we can't hold each other accountable. In fact, both in the community that is envisaged in the Mosaic Law, there was to be a mutual accountability. Also in the early church, there was mutual accountability. Paul sounds quite harsh sometimes when he talks about how if someone persists, for example, in immorality in the community, he says you need to deal with that in the community because you've got to lean into collective accountability to one another.
But with the goal of restoration.
Yes, with the goal of restoration. That's right. Yeah, absolutely. So, but that doesn't contradict the not judging. That's actually this sense we all because we all share this common problem, we need to create a community where we can be accountable to one another. And that includes being accountable for not taking on a judgmental attitude. Now, just because if I hold you accountable, if you, let's say in our church and you treat someone deplorably or rip someone off or I have, not that you have.
I've apologized for that.
Part of being in a Christian community is that there's an understanding that I can come to you and say, hey man, that's not like, that's just not right. And I because it threatens the whole community and it threatens the fabric of our community. And so it doesn't take away from mutual accountability. It doesn't take away from recognizing that evil is evil and that we actually need to do all we can to alleviate suffering and to diminish the evils that are done. We want to create a society that doesn't involve those things as much as we can. We want to curb the evils of human nature.
Yep.
And so he's not taking away from any of those sorts of things. No. He's dealing with the attitudinal thing.
It's attitude. If you're going to, even the word judgment, if you just think of it as holding to account or discernment or discerning between good and evil, we have to be able to do that. We wouldn't be able to function in a society if we couldn't do those things.
Right.
But the point there in the context of judgment there is it's an attitudinal thing. Standing as judge over someone almost implies that we're setting ourselves apart from that person as if we're as if we're at some sort of higher standard than what they are.
Yeah.
If we're going to hold people to account and we're going to seek justice and restitution, we do it with a different attitude than that of a judge.
Yeah.
We do it as if we're not better or higher or more moral or with any less responsibility for the that collective sin that we just keep hurting. That's what we do as humans. We just keep hurting each other. So I'm not placing myself above anyone that I want to condemn. We hold people to account as people should hold me to account as well. We're all functioning at the same level. So it is attitude. Because a lot of people will hear this, and I've wrestled with it myself, and looking at collective responsibility is Well, does it mean then, could it mean that we don't hold people to account because we're all collectively responsible? It's a human problem. It's, so now I actually absolve myself of personal responsibility because I just shrug my shoulders and say, well, I'm human. We're all as bad as each other. And it kind of makes it sound like as if, the bad guys aren't really that bad. And the people who have been hurt or the victims of the pain that we cause, they just sort of need to get over it because they're bad too. You could hear it as being, it kind of diminishes that.
Yeah. And it shouldn't diminish that because evil is evil and it's terrible. It's such pain and suffering that has been caused throughout history. And in no way do we want to take away from that. In fact, we want to do the opposite. We want to create a situation where that happens less, right? That's because it's so bad. We don't want these things to happen again. We don't want the Second World War situation happening. We don't want that. We don't want the sort of racial atrocities and the colonialization of this country. This is where the attitudinal thing is important, because what is it going to take for that sort of thing to not happen again? It takes something transformative within us to happen. And what I'm suggesting, and this is what I think is so powerful about the New Testament teaching around this, is that it takes this inner transformation where we recognize that in me. You know what I mean? That when I am confronted by evil, it's not to diminish that it is a great evil, but there is a sense in which I'm looking in the mirror that the root cause, even though I may not have done that thing, but the root cause is actually in me as well, that I share the same nature. And by recognizing that, I can actually gain, it's through the recognition, the admission of that. I share that, right? That allows not only reconciliation with God, we receive grace from God, but having received grace from God, we put ourselves in that sort of grace zone in a sense, because we are then compelled, at least we should be compelled, then to show grace to other people and not judge other people.
Yep.
Because we recognize, well, I share that same issue, but I have been forgiven. I have received grace from God. So I'm going to choose, when I see that in you, I'm not going to diminish that in you, and I might hold you accountable for that, but I'm not going to set myself off from you or think that I'm better or superior to you. I'm going to show grace.
Yep.
And grace is the thing, grace that allows me to recognize that it actually allows me to see through your behavior and to actually to love you. And to love you means that I recognize your fundamental sacred value as a human being. Yeah. That despite your brokenness and your sin, you are fundamentally, infinitely sacred as a human being and loved by God, and therefore I will love you too. This is what you see. This is what Jesus models. He was able to see those that were held up as being the most evil. And the average Jewish person in the first century would have seen, for example, the tax collectors as being amongst the most evil people, because many, many people, their lives have been ruined by these guys.
And these were their own
traitors. They were their own
Jewish.
Right, they were traitors.
Collecting tax for the Romans.
And that, that was just such a terrible transgression against the community ideals of Jewish people. We stick together, right? And these people, not only have they turned against us, but they know, because these close-knit communities, they know who's earning what, right? And they turn that knowledge to the benefit of the Romans. They sell that knowledge to the Romans, and the Romans allow them actually to take a whole lot more over and above what the Romans were taking. And so these tax collectors, they ruined family after family, right? So that's what you see Jesus doing in that context, is going to these people who are, the worst of the worst in people's eyes, and recognizing their infinite sacred, showing them grace. I'm going to show grace. He was leading the way. He's not that he played down the evil that they were doing. And this is interesting what you see in the case of one very famous example, Zacchaeus, the tax collector. And he's important because he was an arch tax collector, right? He was the boss of the tax collectors. This guy was particularly bad. Jesus says, I'm coming to your house, which is already a gesture of reaching out, very powerful in that cultural context. To eat, you're having communion with. So that already was an expression of grace. He shows grace to this man, And as a result of that experience of grace, he is transformed.
Yep.
And he says, I'm going to repay, I'm going to give 4 times back what I've taken. So there's an example of what transformation looks like. Of course, people became very angry about the way that
I was just going to
Jesus
say,
hung out with people like
it's very triggering. I mean, I've no doubt that people are
triggered
listening
people then
to what we're talking about now is triggering.
Yeah.
Matthew was a disciple.
Yeah, that's
and
right. Yeah,
collector.
I mean, that's exactly. I mean, Matthew, of course, Levi, who was called Matthew, was himself a tax collector, and he was one of the 12 disciples. But you can imagine, and in fact, Jesus was criticized for this. You can't do this. The expectation was that he would be in the grandstands.
Yeah.
Booing and hissing at the bad guys, right? You don't go down into their field and into their house and commune with them. You're meant to set yourself off from them and boo and hiss them, which is what everyone doing. Jesus is saying, no, we don't do that. And he exemplifies really what a redemptive presence looks like. So this really is the core of the Christian response, because what we're looking to bring is not judgment. We're not authorized to bring judgment, right? Because we all share the problem. I mean, in the ultimate sense.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
Remember,
of course.
Yeah. So what we're called to bring is redemption. We're mediators of the redemption of Christ and the power of redemption. And that means that we model that, right? We model, so Zacchaeus became a locus of redemptive power, right? Because he experienced this repentance and this owning that. And I think, if we really want to take evil seriously, then we should not be talking, not trying to judge. Judging is not, that just perpetuates the same thing, because there's no worse kind of superiority than moral superiority, right? That's worse than any other. According to Jesus, moral superiority is the worst kind of superiority, because all sorts of things that really leads you to playing God, and that can justify also, and that has in fact moral superiority down through history has actually been a very key cause of terrible atrocities, all under the the guise of that moral superiority.
So this whole thing of collective responsibility, it is countercultural. It was countercultural back then in Jesus' day, and it's just as relevant as it is today, because it would have triggered people back then. I mean, people would have been shocked at Jesus's association with people that we would have thought he shouldn't be associating with. So, and you could have probably accused him of diminishing the responsibility of those and the suffering of those who were the receiving end of that. So you could make those kind of and I guess that was those accusations definitely would have been thrown at Jesus back then, but it was countercultural then, and it's countercultural now. This is really sort of brings us into then, I think, the importance of worldview, because it's hard to wrap your head around this beyond like a kind of an abstract concept. You could just look at it and go, well, interesting idea that we're all share this collective responsibility, but then how does it actually...
What does it mean
for me
tomorrow?
What does it actually mean to me? But it was obviously a big part of what Jesus wanted to teach us. It's a key part of the gospel, as you've just gone through and explained there, how Jesus responded to those who were doing sort of evil against us, taking some of the worst examples of it and how we're supposed to react to it, which is really difficult for us to wrap our heads around. But I mean, Jesus wanted us to forgive quickly, to turn the other cheek, to show grace, have the right attitude in terms of discerning and holding people to account. These are the things that he wanted us to get. And I think the thing with that is they are the tools that actually help us navigate conflict in our society and how we relate to each other. Now, if we haven't got the Christian worldview, then it is what it looks like in our culture. The drawing of the lines between the good guys and the bad guys. And a lot of good things that we do in that, we get around the victims and we try to hold people to account, but we do it with the wrong attitude and the finger pointing and the judgment, the superiority complex and taking the moral high ground. We remove ourselves from the responsibility in terms of we think we're the good guys and not the bad guys. So it actually, as you watch society now, I think we're going really hard down that path of trying to put things right from the past for injustices and how we treat each other. And I think in our culture, we try to solve that problem. We're dividing up between the good guys and the bad guys. And we're approaching it with all the wrong attitude.
Which will make it worse.
Which is making it worse, because it seems to be like we're becoming more divided.
Everything becomes adversarial.
We haven't got the right tools. The world does not have the right tools to solve these problems.
Because grace is the right tool, and grace comes through Christ. That's right.
But it's also not about restoration, which we touched on before. It's actually just about separation. It's about saying, no, you
as
are
in the world
wrong.
system is not about
that's
restoration.
Right. It's not about restoration.
I just want to add a footnote. A couple of times there you use the word collective responsibility, and I think it's just worth clarifying. Again, lest this be misunderstood. When you talk about that, the point that you're making is, in a sense, collective culpability for the fundamental, the root problem. It doesn't mean that I am personally guilty for the sin, for example, for the sins of my grandfather, let's say, as an example. Right? Or even for the sins of my father. I'm not personally responsible for that. However, I cannot, so while I'm not personally guilty for those sins, yet I do share in the fundamental nature from which those sins came, right? And so therefore I am in no position to judge my father or my grandfather. I mean, I'm just using that, those closer.
So again, it's more about attitude than it is who to blame.
Yeah.
Because
that's right.
Could you read it? At first, you talk about the collective responsibility. I think, well, it's trying to figure out who to blame. And that's actually what's put on us, I think, from our culture today. Is that's the thing, is that we're trying to, I'm suffering, I'm a victim of something, or I'm hurting because of this. Who do I blame? Who do I point the finger at? It's more about focused on attitude.
Yeah.
Because it's the attitude that we need to use to navigate through these problems.
Yeah. And I think that can look like, so for example, you're in a conversation, let's really ground this. You're in a conversation and, people are saying, I just can't believe that guy. Can you believe what that guy did? It's like, how could anyone be so callous? And it looks like actually, and I remember being in a conversation like that, and I started getting drawn into it because I felt angry as those other people. And actually, at one point, I actually checked myself and ended up saying, actually, no, I can believe that actually, because I think I can be a bit like that. And it was such an it was slightly awkward because it was pushing the conversation in an uncomfortable direction, but it wasn't me saying, oh, you guys in this, you're all like that. But I'm not going to point. I don't think that's the way to model this. I think the way to bring this perspective into conversations and overall into our culture is for us actually to model that, to say, and this is the power of confession that is such a fundamental part of the Christian disposition, is that we can lead out in the recognition of it's coming back to the Ezra principle that I talked about in the last episode. It's modeling that penitential attitude. And this is not about us wallowing in guilt and, because penitence, at the same time, there's joy in penitence because it puts us in touch with the grace of God. The more we reckon, where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more, right? As we recognize the problem, so we appreciate more and celebrate the solution. As I recognize, oh no, actually, no, I am like that. I do see this in myself. I see this, let's say if we're talking about some terrible sort of racist thing that's, and yes, we don't deny it. Racism is a terrible, terrible thing that people would be stigmatized and treated unfairly simply because of their race. I mean, goodness me, that's a terrible evil. And yet, at the same time, I can look at myself and say, actually, that superiority complex that led to these people doing that,
that's in me.
It's not for me to say, I just can't believe how callous and how terrible that. No, actually, I do know because I share in the same core issue. And to bring that perspective into conversations where we turn a conversation from talking about those evil people out there and we start to actually recognize, well, how is this in us? To me, that's a Christian direction for
if we're able to look at
a conversation
in that situation in other people and actually approach it with that attitude, we see things in them that we think, I'm glad I'm not like that. And then you realize you are like that.
Yeah.
That is a really important development of your own
self-awareness.
Yeah,
really.
I mean, I guess when you realize that, now I can actually try to be less like that and recognize it within myself. And the danger in, I think, all the things we're talking about is that we've got this strong motivation to not do that.
Yeah.
We don't want to see those things in ourselves that we see in others, so we shut them out and we don't learn from it. We don't see it, and not being able to see it is the big part of the problem.
Yeah.
If we could just see it within ourselves, the tools that we would have to navigate these situations would be a lot better. I mean, there's like a really trivial example, and I'd even hesitate to share it because it trivializes the down, but it to me it sort of really highlights a similar thing to what you're saying before, Matt, about identifying things in other people. But we all experience road rage, right? So we're driving in the car and someone cuts you off, and immediately, I don't know whether you have this problem, but I certainly do, and it doesn't involve any kind of physical gestures or anything, but it's, at least in my mind, I'm thinking, oh, stupid person, where did he get his license? You got it out of a cereal packet, open your eyes, you idiot, all those things are all going.
Say all of that, actually, now I think about it.
It's all going off in your head. And you do that, and you get a bit further down the road, and I'll cut someone off. And then you realise that person's not very happy with you, and you think, oh, give me a break, it was a mistake. I didn't see you, Just think about what you've done. You've actually done the same thing, but your standard of judgment, it's almost is been completely different. And when I was responsible for it, I wanted somebody to understand and show me grace. When I was in the other side with the other person who just cut me off, I was full of judgment and scorn on their driving ability. And so it's a really trivial example, but if I hadn't just gone off at someone in my, and judged them for cutting me off, I wouldn't even have been aware of the fact that there was a difference in my attitude in terms of how I see it. And it's a trivial example, but I see it all the time. Then if I translate it into politics, and different ideas and things, and how I view people and how I treat them, I'm always injecting myself into the story, as I said before, where it's most comfortable for me. And when I see myself doing it, I can stop doing it and I can start to go, well, things are more complicated. Let's show grace. Let's show more forgiveness to people. Let's use that as a starting point, as the perspective, as the worldview that we go to solve a lot of these problems. And that is the worldview that we have as Christians. I think, the last one, I think I said, there's a lens through which we solve the problems before we even get to politics. Yeah. If we start from that place, through that lens, if we can get that right, I think we have the keys to solve a lot of the problems. But if we don't have that lens, we just end up making everything worse.
And that's why the seemingly trivial examples kind of are important, because it's actually the small things in life that we need to begin to implement this. Let's not just think on grand scales here. Yeah. We actually have the opportunity, when I go home and if my wife annoys me, I need to recognize, well, actually I can be pretty annoying too. And so I got to be more gracious. And I got to take that to the next situation and the next situation and the next situation. It's the micro moments. It's those trivial, even when you're driving along on the road. I'm just going to smile and wave, and that's okay, because you know what? I'm a bad driver too. Actually, I'm a terrible driver. So
I can vouch for that, actually.
It might have been you.
Yeah, that's right. But I think that's good. And I think this is a good place to finish. There's something actually we can do about this. It's not just big picture stuff. The attitudinal thing can be developed actually through practice. We can learn to recognize this habitually by actually practicing this. So the next time, you're tempted to get annoyed or angry at someone. And it's okay to get angry, because when we get hurt, and it's what you do with your anger that matters most, and what you harbor in your attitude. And so, I just really encourage us and our listeners to recognize opportunities to actually put this in practice. Because I guarantee even today you will have opportunities to practice this, to actually show a little bit of grace. It's constantly shedding these little bits of grace. And this is what it means for us as Christians to be a redemptive presence in our communities, right? Well, let's start in our homes. Let's bring that redemptive presence into our homes. Because that grace that we're talking about here can transform our closest relationships. And then we can move out from there. We can bring that into our workplaces. And this is a transformative thing. It's not some grand, sudden, big, imposing solution. It's a transformative solution. It will bring such a powerful redemptive presence into our lives, into our families, into our communities. And that is what it means for the seed of the kingdom, little seed, to grow into something great.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Thrive Perspectives. Our hope is that these discussions will challenge you to look at life from a new perspective. You'll find all our resources at the Thrive Today website, thrivetoday.tv. If there's a topic that you'd like us to discuss, please email us. Our email is contact@thrivetoday.tv. Until next time, our prayer is that you will thrive.